Hello viewers and welcome to another installment of the Lord of the Rings The Card Game Progression Series. My name is Mitch.
And my name is Matthew.
And today we continue our evaluation of the LOTR LCG core set. Last time we covered the player cards of our first Sphere of Influence, Leadership, but Matthew, what's on the agenda today?
Well, today is all about tactics. So I suppose we'll begin where we began last time, which is reading what the core set rulebook happens to tell us about this sphere. And it reads, the sphere of tactics emphasizes a hero's martial prowess, particularly as it relates to combat and to overcoming other tactical challenges that might confront the players during the quest. I think perhaps of all of the spheres, I find this one the most satisfying to play, which doesn't necessarily mean to me it's the most powerful, but it's kind of fun to smash in the face of orcs. And so that is something that this sphere does very well. They're really the combat specialists, both when it comes to defense and offense. But they do a few other different things. So Mitch, what does tactics mean to you?
Well, I suppose you really struck the nail on the head when you described it as
or the
very...
orc on the head.
Exactly. It is indeed very visceral. It's got a nice feeling of really engaging with a lot of enemies, taking on the hordes of oncoming orcs, goblins, trolls, Nazgul, whatever the encounter deck throws at you, you're relatively likely to be able to deal with it as the tactics player. They really focus on the combat role almost to the exclusion of all other things. They really focus on attachments in the form of equipments like weapons and armor, go figure. They've got a lot of different card effects to kind of evade or circumvent attacks, and they've got some damage prevention type stuff, but they really kind of fall short when it comes to doing much else. They aren't questing, they aren't managing threat, they're not really contributing toward winning a scenario, but if you need a sphere to handle some big nasty enemies, tactics is definitely a go-to. But as per usual, there's really no better way of illustrating the role and focus of a given sphere than by assessing and checking out its characters. So Matthew, why don't you introduce us to the very first tactics hero of the core set?
So, our very first hero happens to be a dwarf noble warrior, none other than Gimli. He has an 11 threat cost with 2 willpower strength, 2 attack strength, and 2 defense strength, and a whopping 5 hit points. And his ability reads, Gimli gets +1 attack strength for each damage token on him. So, kind of similar to the Glowin hero that we saw last time, whereas Glowin gets an extra resource, which is sort of one of leadership's traits for every damage token on him. Gimli also has a damage token ability, but this time it's focused more on tactics, obviously, which would be increasing his attack strength. And so with that nice pool of 5 hit points, you could get his attack up to 3, 4, 5, maybe even more if there are ways to boost his hit points, and we may see some of those a little bit later today. But I think he's a really interesting hero. Well-rounded in his base level stats. Again, his attack strength could get pumped up, so he could quest in a pinch. He could defend in a pinch. Certainly attack if he gets some damage on him. But it's a pretty good hero.
Yeah, I guess his ability strikes me as the old saying, like father, like son. He is surprisingly versatile for a tactics character, as he's going to become abundantly clear relatively quickly. They really do struggle when it comes to questing, but Gimli is able to contribute too. I think probably what I like most about Gimli is just more so than any other character in the core set, and really more so than any other character for a very long time, he's just able to conjure up unrivaled, consistent amounts of attack value. Mm-hmm. We do end up seeing an ally that's able to reach greater heights than an unbuffed Gimli, but really, as I look forward to occurring in our core set videos, there's just scarcely an enemy that Gimli cannot end up destroying.
So certainly with any good hero, there are often drawbacks. And for one, and again, I won't say this for every card, but I pointed it out a little bit last time, his traits are by and large useless. We will see a bit of a use of the dwarf trait here when we get to a particular attachment, but noble and warrior are basically just flavor text at this point.
Sure.
The other risk is a lot like his kin, Glowin, and that is the high risk of death. With, you're trying to pile up the damage tokens to boost his strength, just like you're trying to get more resources with Glowin. And so if you're doing undefended attacks to boost him up, or even regular defenses, perhaps a stray shadow effect or something could boost up that enemy attack more than you were expecting, and Gimli could die because you're trying to keep damage tokens on him. So you do have to be a little bit careful in how you defend with him or take undefended attacks, but provided you can navigate that riskiness, again, a pretty solid hero, as you mentioned, for attacking consistently throughout the early life of the game.
Yeah, I definitely think that if you're going to be running Gimli in the first place, you might want to include some sort of insurance either in your deck or be playing with a partner that can otherwise provide it, like some access, whether it's you or someone else, to the lore sphere to draw upon healing, or maybe you're running spirit, or you're simply partnered with someone that can provide that shadow cancellation, just to make sure that no game-ending or dwarf-destroying shadow effect does really come and punish you if you do have the boldness, daring, and audacity to especially take an undefended attack. But I think Gimli is a great hero. The small bit of action advantage you can get early on from having Gimli soak an undefended attack and then perhaps destroy whatever enemy you're engaged with in just a single swing is pretty superb. So I think he's great. If you're a jankier deck builder than you could even include our aforediscussed Brock Iron Fist in your deck, just as a bit of a, contingency plan in case he does end up being destroyed. But I can scarcely think of any better stuff to say about Gimli, so I'm a big fan of his. And what is our next hero?
Up next is his bestest pal, Legolas, with a threat cost of 9, 1 willpower strength, 3 attack strength, 1 defense strength, and 4 hit points. Legolas is noble, sylvan, and warrior. He also has the ranged keyword, with the response, after Legolas participates in an attack that destroys an enemy, place 2 progress tokens on the current quest. So, Mitch, you had mentioned that one of the drawbacks is that tactics just doesn't quest very well. And that's true. And for the most part, that remains true to this day. And in essence, questing is how you win the game. And so tactics relatively leaves that phase of the game untouched. But Legolas is an attempt to sort of address that to a degree, although certainly if you're only making 2 progress around, you're not getting very far. But he's addressing the drawback, and it ends up being a pretty helpful ability. Locations are going to be one of those things that often stack up. You've got an active location, and I think it's worth noting that players often think that because his card text reads place on the current quest, that it always goes on the quest, but it's worth noting again that if there is an active location, that acts as a buffer to putting progress tokens on the quest. So you'd put it there first. So it's a great way to clear out locations outside of the questing phase, where you're placing progress tokens. Get a few on there, and then Legolas can polish off a location, so the next turn, all the progress goes on the quest or something. It just is contingent upon him being able to help kill or destroy an enemy, but because he's ranged, he can be sniping all over the table. So he's really a good hero that fairly consistently has remained one of the power heroes from this sphere from the very beginning up until this day.
Yeah, Legolas really introduces a pretty fantastic opportunity for a tactics player to end up just absolutely tearing through a quest. What I really like about Legolas is he's got a pretty low threat cost relative to a character like Gimli. He's not as versatile, but he's also a little bit more specialized. And when it comes to heroes, I like to keep their threat costs as low as possible and to really have them focus on one task. Like Gimli could be a good quester, he could be a good attacker, he could be a good defender, but without really loading him up with action advantage and different things like that, you're unlikely to be having him fill all of those different roles. So Legolas, if you're having him really focus on attacking, then you're really getting a lot of value for the threat cost you're stomaching. So he attacks pretty hard, he hits harder than an unwounded Gimli in the first place. You mentioned that he's got range, so you're going to be able to actually benefit from his effect as many times as is possible, and also worth noting is that there's no limit to the number of times that he can trigger that response. So when we talk about our spirit cards, we're going to be discussing Unexpected Courage, which is an attachment which can repeatedly provide him action advantage. It can ready him again and again, and so long as you've got enemies coming off the top of the encounter deck, you can continue to destroy those, and then you can potentially make a just mountain of quest progress. What I don't really like about Legolas, and this is kind of a small complaint, is that even though you can potentially gain a ton of progress tokens through his ability, you aren't really doing anything during the quest phase to keep the threat in the staging area low. Like, you might be able to clear out active locations relatively easily, you might be able to pass through quest phases relatively quickly, but you're unlikely to be committing him to the quest, and this is just one of those reasons why, tactics can be great at killing enemies, but when it comes to preventing yourself from hitting that 50 threat cap, that's where they kind of struggle. Really, the only other thing I can think of to say about Legolas is that on occasion I've found myself very thankful for his ability, just because he can help to prevent something colloquially referred to as location lock, where maybe you travel to a location, it becomes active, but then you start to struggle and flounder during the quest phase where you can't quite conjure up enough willpower to overcome the amount of threat in the staging area, or you can't make enough progress to clear out the active location and then travel to a new location and start to manage that threat. And that becomes more and more of a problem in a 3 or 4 player game, just because you're revealing more and more locations, but you can still only travel to one. So Legolas is a great opportunity to accomplish some non-framework quest progression, and he's a great hero, and I don't foresee him no longer being a great hero anytime soon.
Yeah, the final thing that I'll add is that the Sylvan trait does eventually get developed, but much, much later in the game's life. And so having some Sylvan synergy will be helpful, I think, and might give Legolas some renewed use in the future. But as you said, he's going to remain relevant for quite a while. Last but not least is perhaps a very undervalued hero, at least in my opinion, and that is Thalam. He's both a dwarf and a warrior, and his threat cost is 9, 1 willpower strength, 2 attack and defense strength, and 4 hit points. And while Thalam is committed to a quest, deal 1 damage to each enemy as it is revealed by the encounter deck. Mitch, I gotta say, in our older progression series, this is a hero that really helped us beat quite a few quests.
Yeah.
But in many ways, he's really undervalued. His willpower strength is relatively low, kind of like Theodred from the Leadership Sphere, where you're almost always going to be questing with them to get their value, but their willpower is kind of stinky. So, with that said, even though he's only contributing 1 to the quest, 1 damage is enough to one-shot some enemies, Eastern Crow, for example. There are certainly others. Or it softens up bigger enemies, so a pumped-up Gimli has an easier time defeating them, or Legolas can snipe over and kill something, and then get those 2 progress tokens because they're softened up. One thing I will add is that his ability is what's known as direct damage, meaning it completely bypasses the defense strength of any enemy, and the one the 1 point of damage goes directly on them. And that's really handy and an important rule clarification to keep in mind if you're going to decide to use this hero.
Yes, I think Thalam is a very deceptively powerful character in that in some scenarios he's going to not really do a whole hell of a lot, but in others he's going to be not quite game-breaking, but he's just going to enable so many monumentally powerful combos. You happen to mention that encounter card, the enemy Eastern Crows. They're 1 HP enemy, and they've got the Surge keyword, but Thalam reads, when he's committed to a quest, you deal a damage to each enemy as it is revealed by the encounter deck. And we've had clarified in our official LOTR FAQ document that as it is revealed occurs prior to any encounter card keywords. So Surge, if he outright kills the enemy, as is the case for the Eastern Crows, that does not resolve, and therefore your revealed encounter card is just dead. It doesn't surge to another encounter card. Doomed does not go off, and when revealed does not go off. And then further, even if you just wound a bunch of enemies that are coming off of the encounter deck, I suppose first of all it's worth saying that there's no limit to the number of enemies he can damage, and we're going to be discussing a number of other direct damage effects that tactics can use. So if you can outright destroy an enemy through these direct damage effects, you're giving yourself action advantage because you don't have to worry about defending or taking undefended attacks. So he's got an awesome pool of HP, he's rather unlikely to die during questing, and he's another dwarf for Brock Ironfist, and if you can give him any kind of action advantage, then he's hitting reasonably hard. He's actually a pretty damn reasonable defender. So Thalam definitely strikes me as a hero where he may not be particularly well suited to bring to each and every scenario, but on occasion he's going to be absolutely fantastic. But now that we've covered our 3 tactics heroes, why don't you lead us through our allies?
Up first is the Gondorian Spearmen with a cost of 2, 0 willpower, 1 attack, 1 defense strength, and 1 hit point. He is both Gondor and warrior and has the Sentinel keyword. And response: after Gondorian Spearman is declared as a defender, deal 1 damage to the attacking enemy. So kind of a little sub-theme going on here with tactics. We first saw it with Thalam and the direct damage there when questing. And here, the Gondorian Spearman deals some direct damage when defending. Now, unfortunately, he's not the best defender in the sense that his defense strength is low and his hit points are low. But he might be able to just pick off an enemy before it even gets its attack in. So if it has only 1 hit point, he's killing that enemy. If it only has 1 hit point left, he's also killing that enemy before it has the chance to swing. And even if not, if you just need a chump blocker, we talked about those on the last episode with Snowborn Scout, at least this one is doing some damage before he dies nobly for the cause. So this is really a great ally. It's one that you'll probably see in our tactics decks for a long time to come because just fills so many roles. He's cheap and he does some damage, and that's always a good thing.
Right. So, similar to how Legolas has the ranged keyword, which affords him the opportunity to trigger his ability as often as is possible, the Gondorian Spearman, by merit of having the Sentinel keyword, is going to be able to defend for any player. So maybe I'm not the one that's engaged with an enemy that has just 1 hit point remaining. Maybe that happens to be you, Matthew. So if that's the case, I can have my Spearman block for you, and before you reveal your shadow card, before my ally, my defending ally, takes any damage, if they have a number of damage tokens equal to their HP value, then they're immediately destroyed. So they don't trigger any sort of shadow card, they don't maybe trigger any kind of ability, and if you've got enough direct damage effects, whether it's this, whether it's Thalam, that's an absolutely fantastic way of just really saving yourself from a giant bit of a headache. He's only got the 1 HP, but he's generally not exhausted during the quest phase, so at least so far as the core set is concerned, he's immune to most forms of direct damage coming out of the encounter deck. He's even got a drop of attack value. If you're running 4 Gondor, he gets a +1 defense value, so maybe some miracle happens and he survives defending and deals a point of damage. But really, when it comes down to it, it's another deceptively simple ally, probably my utmost favorite ally from the core set, at least in the tactics sphere. So, cool character, and I definitely look forward to using him. I'm sure there's only going to be more and more Gondor synergy in time, and as there's only ever going to be more direct damage, I can't see the value of this ally ever really decreasing in time, unless something absurd gets released.
It's almost like you have a Palantir and you can gaze into the future. Some of these things will indeed come to pass. But up next, Veteran Axe Hand. Cost of 2. 0 willpower strength, once again. 2 attack strength, 1 defense strength, and 2 hit points. So you mentioned last time that when you spend X number of resources, you like to sort of see that X value represented in their stats. And we kind of finally get one. So we have 2 costs, and we get 2 attack strength and 2 hit points. And that's nice, particularly because the Veteran Axe Hand, while both a dwarf and a warrior, has no other abilities or text other than flavor text in the text box. So very vanilla, but decent attack value for the cost. And the dwarf trait may or may not come in handy fairly soon.
Spoilers! Yes, I really can't think of too much to say about this character. 2 HP is better than 1, so it makes it all the more likely that it's going to be able to survive some sort of defense for you, but really, when it comes to it, this is just another body. It's a cheap source of a reasonable bit of attack value, and there are plenty of different effects which allow the tactics player or a leadership player to buff the attack value of allies, but really, when it comes down to it, 2 cost, 2 attack, it's a totally reasonable ally that's only going to get better once we start to develop that dwarf synergy.
Moving right along, we have our next ally, which is the Horseback Archer. Cost of 3, 0 willpower strength, 2 attack strength, 1 defense strength, and 2 hit points. So the stat line, identical to the Veteran Axe Hand, but costs 1 more. So why might that be? Well, this ally doesn't have really any abilities other than the range keyword. The traits are Rohan and Archer, which again, at this point in the game's life, don't mean much, though Rohan will be sort of expanded upon in future cycles. So we're basically paying 1 extra resource for that ranged ability. It is a little bit expensive, particularly if we compare it to modern allies that maybe have similar stats and abilities and they cost less. But in general, I think it's a fairly decent ally, even if it's expensive. So it's you can use that 2 attack strength on your own side, snipe over with Legolas maybe to do a ranged attack somewhere else. So again, decent ally if expensive.
Yeah, this isn't really a character that I've used too awful much. I do feel like it is just a step up in expense from the Veteran Axe Hand, but it doesn't really do much more for you. Legolas by himself is generally going to be enough to assist the other player in scoring some kills, and certainly this can help guarantee that Legolas is going to be able to trigger his ability, like an outgoing attack of 5 is going to be much more effective than 3, or helping your partner for 5 is going to be much more effective than 3, but when it comes down to it, that really is a difficult cost. It seems, especially once we start to talk about our tactics events, their resources are going to be so scarce and so valuable just because tactics doesn't exactly do resource acceleration very well. They do it better than card draw, but really you're always hurting for resources. If you go for a 3 tactics hero deck, sometimes you're able to conjure up such ridiculous highs of attack value that it just starts to become absurd, and you hit the point of diminishing returns relatively quickly. So, as should be abundantly clear by now in looking at our third tactics ally, there's that trend of not having any willpower whatsoever associated with these characters. Like Gimli had 2, Thalam had 1, Legolas had 1, and now we're down to just flat out 0. So tactics is just so laser focused on combat. It just seems like the Horseback Archer is too expensive for what a lot of other cards can accomplish for less. So it's fine, but it's just expensive enough that I'm really, really hesitant to actually put this guy in decks. But we've got a much more interesting ally left to cover, so Matthew, please introduce us to our unique.
Last but not least, we get Beorn. Hefty cost of 6, 1 willpower, 3 attack, and 3 defense strength, and a whopping 6 hit points. He's both a Beorning and a warrior, and his action reads: Beorn gains plus 5 attack strength until the end of the phase. At the end of the phase in which you trigger this effect, shuffle Beorn back into your deck, limit once per round. So again, hefty cost. Might be difficult to get on the table because, as we mentioned, some of these tactics effects are a little bit expensive. We're going to see some more expensive tactics cards here in a moment. But man, how fun is it to trigger that ability? It doesn't happen all the time, but when you do, he's taking down almost even the mightiest of foes.
Yes, Beorn is an incredible card in the possibilities and the dream with this guy. It's just absurd. We talked about Brock Iron Fist in the last video. He was a 6 cost unique, but he had 9 total stat points, identical to the hero Glowin. Beorn, for the same cost, albeit in a different, less resource acceleration prone sphere, has a total of 13 points, and that's without triggering his ability. So he's got a drop of willpower, which I'm not willing to pay 6 resources for, but he swings for a base of 3, and he's just an absolutely incredible defender. I mean, 3 defense and 6 hit points is just crazy. Certainly there are easier ways for a tactics player to kind of deal with or evade incoming enemy attacks. So I think it's very cool what you might be able to accomplish with Beorn. Having the opportunity to attack for 8 is a spectacular boss killer style effect. It is a shame that he does get shuffled back into your deck, but I think this is maybe the kind of effect you'll only need once during a game. If you've got effects like Ever Vigilant, you might be able to manage 2 swings of 8 with this character, and by himself, that might be enough to end up killing a reasonably daunting foe. Like the Hill Troll and the Nazgul of Dol Guldur, the 2 most daunting and formidable enemies of the entirety of the core set, they only need an attack of 12 to match their defense plus HP. So Beorn is a potentially incredible card. It's just, with that incredible expense, and given how effective tactics is without such expensive characters, I just can't help but wonder if he might end up being a bit of a win more card, where to be able to fund such an expensive card effect, things probably already have to be going pretty right for you.
The final thing I'll say is he has a rockin' hipster beard, so pretty cool art to top off a pretty cool ally.
Yes, and I guess the only other things I'll add is if you do play this character hoping for some rock-solid defender, just do bear in mind that if ever you do encounter a card effect that requires you to discard an ally, whether it's a Snowborn Scout or whether it's Beorn, they're both allies, they're not heroes, and even despite that giant pool of 6 HP, it's only heroes that can ever be assigned the damage of an undefended attack. So, super cool character. Of course, he's fantastic, used in conjunction with Sneak Attack. The first player gets to determine what order those effects are resolved in. So, Sneak Attack involves you returning a character put into play to your hand at the end of the phase. Bjorn requires you shuffle him into your deck. So the first player can decide, I'm gonna, go ahead and return Bjorn to hand instead of the deck. So potentially it's a swing of 8 for just one resource. Bjorn certainly isn't a character I've seen used much, but he can get a lot done, and I'll be very curious to see what, if anything, we end up doing with him.
Up next are our tactics attachments, and the very first one is Blade of Gondolin. It has a cost of 1, and the item and weapon traits. It must attach to a hero, and it's also restricted, and the attached hero gets +1 attack strength when attacking an orc. There's also a response, which reads, after the attached hero attacks and destroys an enemy, place 1 progress token on the current quest. So, a pretty good card. It's very cheap as far as a lot of attachments go, and it has multiple effects. If you happen to be attacking an orc, you get extra attack strength. But even if you're not attacking an orc, provided you kill the enemy, then you get an extra progress token. So Legolas is a natural for this, to make him place 3 progress tokens instead of just 2. But really any hero can benefit from being able to place progress tokens. So it's really a nice attachment that's going to have a long shelf life, I think.
Yeah, I do think this is a pretty cool card. It's not very often that I actually manage to derive appreciable benefit from the ability where it's +1 attack when attacking an orc. Often enough, Legolas is going to be able to just eliminate an orc enemy without any external assistance. For instance, like the Dol Guldur orcs, they've got no defense and they've got 3 hit points, so Legolas just eliminates these outright. And I mentioned Legolas without even really giving it any thought, just because I think you want to stack this effect with his ability just so you can kind of treat enemies like a precious resource that you're trying to derive the most value possible from. Like if you've got a Blade of Gondolin on Gimli and he kills an enemy, and unless Legolas is able to participate in that attack as well, then you're not getting your maximum number of progress tokens. Often enough, I think orcs that you do encounter are going to have some weird number of hit points where whether you got the +1 attack or not, it's not really going to make a big bit of difference, and certainly there are plenty of quests where you're not fighting orcs at all, but I feel like additional progress tokens is never a bad thing. It's always great when a tactics player is doing something to contribute to a quest, so I think this is great. Put it on Legolas, ideally. Put Unexpected Courage on Legolas with Blade of Gondolins, ideally. Do mind that because it's restricted, you can only have 2 restricted attachments on one character. With tactics, that does start to become a bit of an issue, but really, I don't have much else to say. Blade of Gondolin, great card. I certainly am going to be playing it.
Well, that is certainly a ringing endorsement if I've ever heard one, Mitch.
Ever so often, I try to have a more than neutral or lukewarm opinion on these cards.
Yeah. You mean you don't want to say this is a mixed bag?
That's right. God forbid I ever say such a thing. Oh,
jeez. What fool will do that? Up next, Horn of Gondor. It is an item and an artifact that costs 1 resource token. It also attaches to a hero, and it's also restricted. And this card has recently received an errata, so the text you have on your physical card might not be the same. But here is the new official text. Response. After a character is destroyed, add 1 resource to attach hero's pool. So they added this new destroyed language to mean dies in combat, or somehow, getting damage tokens equal to its hit points.
Right.
not just if it leaves play, like Beorn's ability, for example. So for many, many years, Beorn's ability would have triggered the Horn of Gondor, and it made his his cost maybe a little less steep. But now they have to die in battle, which thematically is a bit more fitting for this card. But in many ways, most players, I think, have come down the side of this as nerfed the power of the Horn of Gondor. And nerfed simply means sort of weakened or lessened the power. I still think it's a pretty decent card because I do think characters, either heroes or allies, do die often enough in combat that you will see some benefit from this. And frankly, this card used to have a similar problem of Steward of Gondor. Eventually, in the mid or the late game, you're piling up so many resources that you tend to not be able to spend them at such a quick pace, and this is a bit more manageable. So even with the new errata, I think it's still a fairly decent card, if less potent.
Yeah, I think decent is fair. Even when this was when characters leave play, you gain a resource, at least in the core set context. And the first few deluxe expansions and adventure pack cycles, I was never blown away by its power. But the game really started to go in the direction of a lot of decks built around this concept of allies constantly entering play and leaving play. So I feel it was right that they nerfed this card. The problem nowadays is that I really try to build decks with as little ally destruction occurring as possible. Especially in the core set, it seems like each and every resource token you spend is so valuable, and the longer you can keep allies in play, the more they're going to end up doing for you. So I don't find myself managing to trigger the Horn of Gondor very often, but the more players are in your game, the more likely you're going to be triggering the Horn of Gondor, and because there's no limit to the number of times per phase or per round that this effect can trigger, the fact that it can proc or process off of any character being destroyed on the entire table, it includes allies and, God forbid, heroes, this can be a pretty powerful effect. It's just another one of those powerful, unique cards where you might really kind of be clogging up your deck by running multiple redundant copies. It's worth noting that it's restricted, and I like that in the middle of the combat phase, you might be able to chump block with an ally against some weak enemy, only to pick up a resource token to fund some sort of event, maybe one that we'll be covering shortly, just to help you manage some much more powerful enemy. So it's a cool card, but man, it's definitely seen a reduction in power.
We have 2 attachments left, and so up next is Dwarven Axe. It has a cost of 2, and it's an item and a weapon. It also must attach to a hero, and it's also restricted. The attached hero gains +1 attack strength and +2 attack strength instead if the attached hero is a dwarf. So finally, a smidge of Dwarven synergy. I think it's a decent card. 2 costs for 1 attack strength isn't the best, but it's decent. There are relatively few ways to boost attack strength in the game for quite a while, and you can maybe even argue today there's still only a handful of ways to consistently increase attack strength. But even better on a dwarf, then you're getting 2 for 2, so Gimli swinging for more, perhaps Thalam, Glowin. It's a pretty handy card.
Yeah, I think the fact of the matter is that for the core set and for a long time to come, it's just very difficult to increase the attack value of a hero. And Dwarven Axe doesn't really have any frills associated with it. It might be a little bit expensive, especially played on a non-dwarf, but it's just a flat attack bonus. It's not contingent upon what traits the enemy receiving your attack has. It's just a nice, simple fact of the matter boost. It is better, of course, on a dwarf. On Gimli that you mentioned, it can sometimes be a little bit redundant in that he can achieve such a ridiculously high attack value, but if you can accomplish with one character what used to take you multiple characters, then that itself is a bit of action advantage. So I think this is a pretty good card. Once we break into our spirit video, we'll be talking about a hero that's in desperate need of being able to increase his attack value. So I think it's cool. Blade of Gondolin is elvish. It's all about finesse and refinement. It's a very contingent effect that isn't going to be triggering all the time, and Dwarven Axe is just brutish. It's simple, but it gets the job done. So cool card, and I guarantee that you're going to be seeing this one in our videos.
Last but not least is our hefty 4-cost Citadel Plate. It's an item and an armor. It also must attach to a hero and is restricted, and the attached hero gets plus 4 hit points. So that is a pretty huge hit point bonus. Or 1 resource, 1 hit point, so we're paying 4 total, we get 4. That's a pretty decent bargain. Certainly this would be great for a hero like Gimli. You can boost up his attack strength to even more because he has more room for damage. Same thing with Glowin. If Glowin has a larger pool of hit points, he's making those resources flow much more steadily. So while, again, the initial investment is quite hefty, it could end up paying off throughout the life of a particular game.
Yeah, I think this is a very expensive but very powerful attachment. There are a few different cards in the core set which can just deal a tremendous amount of damage to players. There's an enemy called Hummerhorns, which has an engagement cost of 40, and as soon as it engages with someone, whether that's optional or mandatory, you have to pick one of your heroes to take 5 points of damage. Considering that every hero in the core set has 5 or less hit points, normally that equates to a dead hero unless you've got Citadel Plate to help you out. If the Hill Troll attacks you for 6, normally that's killing a character, but Citadel Plate can help you survive that, and it can even spare you from having to chump block against that enemy because any damage that spills over, like any points of damage above and beyond the defender's HP plus defense, you normally gain that in the form of a threat increase, but that's unlikely to happen if Gimli, say, has a 9 HP reservoir and he ends up only taking 4 points of damage after his defense. This is also superb in just allowing you more opportunity to survive undefended attacks, or you can just be more ballsy, taking undefended attacks without living in fear of your, hero dying if you just so happen to get a shadow card that's like +1 attack or +2 attack if undefended. So this is very cool. It's always nice to have a big reservoir of HP associated with a character just because it affords you more opportunity to heal. The bigger your pool of HP, the more surprise or spike damage you can take and then heal it all away. Once we talk about our lore cards, there's an event called Lore of Imladris, which just removes all damage from a character. So if you're going to be stripping away something like 13 points of damage off of one dwarf, as opposed to like 4, then that just increases the value of the other card. So it's a great attachment. It does come at a significant expense, but regardless, I'm definitely excited to see this one on the tabletop again.
So that rounds out our attachments, and up next are the 7 tactics events from the core set. First up is Stand Together. It is a 0-cost event, and its action reads, choose a player. That player may declare any number of his eligible characters as defenders against each enemy attacking him this phase. This is an interesting card, and it's created quite a few rules conundrums. So what exactly does it mean when you have multiple characters defending together? Well, it means you pool their defense strength values. But let's say some damage is still getting through, so who do you assign it to? So this card has caused quite a bit of confusion. In general, I don't think I've actually ever seen anyone play this, even in the days of the core set. Certainly could be valuable if you need to defend against the Nazgul or the Hill Troll who raises your threat or something. But in general, it's more effective to find ways to deal with it with Citadel Plate or some other events that we'll see. And then if you end up defending with a bunch of people, then you have no one to swing back with, and so there's that complication. So an interesting card. I actually really like the idea of it, but in practicality, it just doesn't seem worth it to me. But what do you think, Mitch?
Well, this is indeed an intriguing card. I think the major problem here is most characters we've seen thus far have maybe 2 points of defense at most, and if you're rallying a bunch of defenders together, maybe it's, -2 attack to the attacking enemy, -1 attack, minus another point of attack, and then whatever leftover damage all ends up being assigned to one character. It just really seems like you're sapping a lot of available allies and heroes that all have to defend to attack just to be able to stomach or absorb some incoming blows. So we've talked about chump blocking time and time again by now, and it just seems like if you throw one ally under the bus and then rally all your remaining characters together to attack, dispatch, and destroy your assailant, that's such a, it's an effective way of eliminating an enemy. Like, maybe it's cool if you get a bunch of defenders together and you manage to assemble 6 total combined defense strength so that you don't take any damage or gain any threat from a hill troll attack. Like, that's really cool, but then good luck managing to conjure up the 12 total attack value necessary to destroy the hill troll. So I think in maybe the best case scenario, you can survive one attack just to set yourself up for an attachment we'll cover in our lore video, Forest Snare, where you can stop the enemy from making any subsequent attacks, or maybe you can delay one enemy dealing you enough damage so that you can, the next round, make like the quest push that's going to be winning the game. But as should probably be abundantly clear, because Matthew and I are kind of hemming and hawing about this card, and we're thinking of these increasingly unlikely kind of corner case scenarios, this really just is not the best event. We're going to be covering so many other options that are just so much more effective. There's certainly some cool, really context-dependent things you can do with this card, like you could have Thalam damage an enemy as it's revealed from the encounter deck, and then if you've got 3 Gondorian Spearmen, maybe you could have all of them combine their defensive power and together defend against the same enemy, and each deal it a point of damage and kill it before it can do you any harm in return. But this is a very underwhelming card. I've honestly never seen or heard of anyone playing it, and I really think that's saying something. So, cost of 0, not exactly a bargain in this case.
I feel like we should make it a goal to try to pull this card off, to 3 Gondorian Spearmen and to stand together or something. Like we're unlocking some sort of achievement like a video game. But yeah, again, I've never seen it either, but it's kind of cool in theory.
Sure. So, dear viewers, let Matthew and I know in the comments if you've ever pulled this off, or if you've ever heard tell of someone pulling it off. Maybe even fabricate something. We'll never know. But please, Matthew, next event, let's forget about Stand Together.
Luckily, this one I have seen be used, and it's the event Blade Mastery with a cost of 1. Action: choose a character. Until the end of the phase, that character gains +1 attack strength and +1 defense strength. So, kind of nice. I mean, it doesn't last very long. It's just for the phase. But if it's the combat phase and you're getting some extra attack or defense, that could be handy. Particularly if you can get multiple uses out of the character. If they can both defend and attack, even better. But as we mentioned, there aren't a whole lot of attack strength boosting cards in the core set in the early life of the game. Similarly, there aren't a whole lot of defense boosting cards in the early life of the game, so even if you're just paying 1 for 1 and you don't use both, I think in a pinch, this can serve as a nice boost to get you that extra edge you might need.
It can certainly be all right. It just strikes me as a very underwhelming card for the fact that it is a card and it costs 1 resource. I like that you can just pick a character, so this can affect allies and heroes both. Certainly with action advantage, it does get better because you can benefit from whether it's the attack or the defense or both more than one time. Don't get me wrong, that's great, but for Gondor is a leadership card, and for one additional resource, albeit in a different sphere, then it's every character gets +1 attack, which is so much more valuable. Even your, Gondorian Spearmen, and if you have as much as one other character that's available to attack, you're already getting so much more benefit from that. It just seems like the tactics character is generally so strapped for resources that if you're spending cash on an effect like this, it just seems like it's such a marginal effect. Like if you're running Gimli and he alone might be able to swing for 6, Blade Mastery adding 1 paltry attack power to a single character just seems like such a wussy little effect. So I'm not really thrilled with this one, and maybe in the core set it's okay to include it in a deck, but this just really strikes me as a replace as quickly as possible contender when you're sitting down and building like a really powerful deck that does include tactics.
Speaking of replace as quickly as possible, we have the worthless one-cost event Feint. It is a combat action, and you get to choose an enemy engaged with a player. That enemy cannot attack that player this phase. So one thing I'll mention before I even talk about the card is this is probably in the top 3, if not even number 1, cards misused from the core set. And it goes back to sort of the word that I stressed when reading its ability. It is a combat action, meaning there are some enemies that attack during the questing phase. And so you cannot use this card then. It can only be used during the combat phase of the game. Right. So any other attack that could happen during planning or questing or the refresh phase, anything outside of combat, you cannot use Feint. So number 1 rule mistake with this card, probably top 3 rule mistakes in the core set. With that said, since most attacks happen during the combat phase, really a fantastic event. It's cheap. You can outright cancel an attack, so you don't have to exhaust somebody to defend. You can focus all your dudes on attacking. Very simple card in theory, but oh so powerful.
Yes, even with the errata that this received, it's still incredibly powerful. Once upon a time, it used to be you choose an enemy engaged with a player. That enemy cannot attack this phase. So there are, on occasion, enemies that count as being engaged with every player, or they attack every player each round, and normally those are pretty nasty big boss style enemies, and Feint was just a fantastic way to shut that down entirely. So the power of this card has been reined in a little bit, but this is even better than a chump blocker. It's the same cost as a Snowborn Scout, but it spares you having to actually deal with an incoming enemy attack. For instance, if a shadow card, like let's say you defend with a chump blocker, and your shadow card is something like return the defending character if it's an ally to its owner's hand. All of a sudden, you don't have a defender, and then that counts as an undefended attack. Maybe one of your heroes die. Or maybe the shadow card is deal 5 points of damage to the defending character. If that ally dies, then it's another undefended attack, and maybe your hero is killed. The Nazgul of Dol Guldur has a forced effect which reads, after a shadow effect dealt to Nazgul of Dol Guldur resolves, the engaged player must choose and discard 1 character he controls. So if you can prevent abilities like that from occurring, if you can prevent shadow effects, it's just so much more safe than a chump blocker. Plus, you spare the life of one of your allies. So, Feint is just superb. It can even set you up for stalling an enemy until you can push through the quest the following round, or you can set yourself up to use that aforementioned forest snare. It's just absolutely incredible, provided you're playing it correctly, which is during the combat phase. How can you go wrong with so powerful an effect? So, awesome card, staple 3 of in essentially every tactics deck for at least the first few years of LOTR. So, awesome card.
Absolutely. And up next is also a pretty good card. Quick Strike with a cost of 1. Action, exhaust a character you control to immediately declare it as an attacker and resolve its attack against any eligible enemy target. So kind of similar to Feint in the sense that if you're able to outright kill the enemy with this attack, you can bypass having it attack you at all and needing a defender and all those sorts of things. So for example, if Gimli's pumped up with some Citadel Plates, has lots of damage on him, is swinging for like 1,000,000, you can quick strike him and kill that enemy before you have to defend against it. So pretty great card, provided you have enough attack strength to nuke an enemy before you have to defend.
Yeah, and that's really the only complaint that I could possibly level at this card, is it requires ever so slightly more setup than does Feint, so maybe it's less useful in the early game before you've got your primary attacker loaded up with attachments, if it's Gimli loaded up with damage, but it can certainly do some pretty damn decent things. Even in the early game, you could use Quick Strike with a ranged character to shoot across the table and snipe a relatively weak enemy engaged with someone else prior to their ability to resolve an attack. And then, of course, in the end game, you can turn Gimli into a monster that can one-hit kill any enemy in the game, so if you can set this up to be an improved version of Feint, then go nuts. So this can be a superb bit of action advantage in and of itself, so great card, less good than Feint, but still strikes me as a staple.
Next event is Rain of Arrows. It also costs 1, and its action reads, exhaust a character you control with the range keyword to choose a player. Deal 1 damage to each enemy engaged with that player. This is another card to me, kind of like Stand Together, that seems really cool in theory, but in practice, it's not doing a whole lot. It does sort of stink to have to exhaust a ranged character, of which there are few in the core set. Certainly today there are a bit more. And you're paying 1 to damage each enemy engaged with that player, which could honestly be quite a lot. 1 damage maybe in combo with the Gondorian Spearmen or Thalam or something, right? If they're already sort of softened up a little bit, could be worthwhile. It's a card I've not seen used very much, even though it could be pretty cool. But what do you think of this one?
Well, I think the ideal situation, the optimal resolution of Rain of Arrows, if you've got a player engaged with multiple weak or wounded enemies, and you're able to turn the action of one ranged character into functioning similar to Quick Strike, where you dispatch or destroy multiple enemies in one fell swoop. But this is a card you have to draw, it costs a resource, and I think more often than not you're going to be relatively disappointed by this. I think, especially in the core set, and it's not like Rain of Arrows gets dramatically better anytime soon as we start to open up adventure packs, deluxe expansions, and whatnot. The fact of the matter is 1 damage isn't going to be very much. You have to have a ranged character. Legolas is probably the most abundantly available one, and even if you do manage to kill some enemy with this effect, then you're not triggering Legolas's ability. I think this can get dramatically better if you play it in multiples, but then you have to think, what's the likelihood that I'm gonna draw this card? Do I really want to include multiple copies of it in my deck? Am I going to be using action advantage effects on a ranged character to be able to use multiple copies of Rain of Arrows during the same round? Or am I going to have multiple ranged characters? Like I said, I don't generally use the Horseback Archer much, or when I do have it in decks, it's not often I manage to get it in play. So I think that tactics is normally good enough in combat that you're generally revealing enemies from the encounter deck and dealing with them in really short order. It's not often that I have one player that just is bogged down with enemies and they just cannot get rid of them. So the possibilities here are cool. I think ever so often this is going to result in one hell of a story for you to tell people, but 95 times out of 100, I think you're going to draw this card and curse your, ever having included this in your deck. But listeners' mileage may vary.
We have 2 tactics cards to go, and so up next is Swift Strike. It costs 2, and its response reads, after a character is declared as a defender, deal 2 damage to the attacking enemy. Certainly a cool card. Could be used in combo with the Gondorian Spearmen, but then you're paying 4 for a total of 3 damage.
Right.
2 from this card, 2 from Gondorian Spearmen. So kind of expensive. Of course, it can be used with any defender. It doesn't have to be that one. It's okay. It doesn't get a lot of use today in the core set when we didn't have a lot of options. Certainly, it's a bit more useful. But what are your thoughts here?
Well, in the leadership video, I said that I view Lord of the Rings, the living card game, as a puzzle game now and then, and Swift Strike certainly does offer a solution to a very specific puzzle or question that the encounter deck might present a prospective deck builder. I know that in the original Progression series, there was certainly a scenario that you and I were playing which involved multiple copies of an enemy that, when revealed from the encounter deck, it would automatically attack a player. It had relatively low hit points, and Thalam, combined with Swift Strike, allowed us an opportunity during the quest phase to destroy this enemy. So it did not count its threat against us during staging. It didn't engage with us and then, launch a second attack. So I think on occasion, Swift Strike is going to be great. I just don't think that occasion is going to present itself very often. So just like Gondorian Spearmen might deal the final point of damage to kill a hill troll once you whittle away most of its 9 hit points, the same thing can be said with Swift Strike. So on occasion, it's going to be a great action saver, but I definitely wouldn't hold your breath for this one to be fantastic, and certainly it does not come cheap, but it's a cool card. I just wouldn't expect to get much benefit from it outside of a really specific context.
And that brings us to our final tactics cards of the core set, Thicket of Spears. Hefty cost of 3, and you must use resources from 3 different heroes' pools to pay for this card. Action, choose a player. That player's engaged enemies cannot attack that player this phase. So sort of a souped up version of Feint, where it can just blanket cancel all enemy attacks. So if you have a bunch of enemies engaged with you for whatever reason, I guess the biggest drawback is you can't just have one hero with Horn of Gondor and a wealth of resources there to pay for it. It's got to be from each of your tactics heroes. A card that doesn't see a lot of use, but certainly I can imagine situations in which this would be very useful because Feint can only cancel one attack.
Yeah, I think the possibilities with this card are awesome. The problem just comes down to the fact that if you're running a mono sphere 3 tactics hero deck, you're hitting that point of diminishing returns, like I said before. If you've got 3 tactics heroes, I would say that the odds are, once you get an enemy engaged with you, it's not going to be around for very long. It's going to be quickly rent asunder and torn apart by just your heaps and gobs of attack strength that you can fling at it. So Thicket of Spears is just kind of an unnecessary card. I mean, Feint does a pretty damn decent job, as do the myriad other tactics events we've covered. Hopefully you've got an ally that can assist you ever so often with defending, like maybe I've got Aragorn, and I'm going to be able to use his Sentinel keyword to spare you from having to stomach an incoming attack or something like that. I think it's going to be more likely that this card could see play once we start to see more card effects along the lines of Calabrian Stone. Like if that's attached to Aragorn, it gives him a spirit sphere of influence resource icon. So we eventually see these cards with the song keyword, and they give the attached hero a resource icon of a different sphere. So maybe if you were doing 2 tactics heroes and then 1 hero with the tactics song, you'd be able to fund a Thicket of Spears, but it's just so incredibly expensive. I think the likelihood of being able to pay its cost, and not just its resource cost, is very, very low, and it just doesn't strike me as terribly necessary. It got the same exact errata treatment that Feint did, and, as much as I hate to say it, I'm just not terribly impressed by this, undeniably very powerful event. So, as much as I kind of hate to end the video on a whimper, Matthew, that concludes our overview of tactics. So, as always, what are your overall impressions of tactics within the confines of the core set?
So certainly there are, different strokes for different folks. As far as I'm concerned, I find tactics the most satisfying of the spheres, meaning I find it the most fun to play. It's just kind of fun to kill stuff in a game.
Thank you for prefacing that.
Yes, not real life, kids. But it's fun. It's fun to take care of those orcs. It's really cool to take a big attack or have just enough attack strength to kill that big enemy or something. I guess the drawback, and this is going to be plaguing tactics really until this day, is that while combat is a big aspect of the game, and while if combat doesn't go well, you're then questing less well in a future round. Really, it's all about making progress on the quest and clearing locations and those sorts of things. And so, while tactics might be the most fun for me to play, I certainly realize that it's hampered by its ability to contribute directly to the quest. So really the way it contributes is by making sure the questing players are not being bogged down by enemies, and that tactics can keep that sort of relatively clear. So it's a very indirect way of helping you win. But if a quest doesn't have a lot of enemies or something, then tactics is sort of just sitting around, contributing a paltry amount. But with that said, it is probably my favorite sphere to play, even if it's not the sphere I play most often. So I'm sure I'll probably be fairly favorable towards most tactics cards in general as we go forward.
Yeah, I think that tactics definitely provides an invaluable service to the players in affording them the ability to deal with pretty much any kind of enemy that does come off the top of the encounter deck. The problem just comes from that they really can't do much when it comes to questing or managing threat or dealing with treachery cards and things along those lines. So, I would definitely never balk at having Matthew playing a really tactics-heavy deck. It isn't necessarily the tactics player which takes the players from their humble beginnings to the end of a scenario. So definitely, it's impossible to win most quests without some sort of formidable combat presence on part of the players, but tactics isn't necessarily the end-all, be-all of this game. It's the first really specialized sphere that we've been able to cover in our core set review. Next up, we're going to be talking about Spirit, which is equivalently laser-focused instead on questing. So tactics is a cool sphere. It's not necessarily my chosen playstyle, but certainly it's a fantastic feeling doing a whole lot of questing and staging area management and watching enemies consistently come off the encounter deck only to get mulched by Matthew here. So cool sphere. I'm a fan. Again, not quite my cup of tea, but I certainly could not imagine LOTR LCG without it. So, I suppose that brings another video in the Lord of the Rings The Card Game Progression series to a close. So Matthew, why don't you throw out your plugs and we'll end it here.
So I would love it if you would check out the podcast. I so happen to be a co-host on the Gray Company podcast. You can find us on all sorts of interwebs. We are on Twitter. We are on Facebook. We have a website, graycompanypodcast.com. That is gray with an E, not an A. So if you are looking for an in-depth Lord of the Rings LCG podcast focusing on strategy, deck building, and the metagame, be sure to check us out.
Well, that sounds good to me, and it certainly comes highly recommended to give a listen to indeed. So, my dear viewers, my dear listeners, thank you once again for checking out another installment of the Lord of the Rings The Card Game Progression Series. Be sure to share with Matthew and I your own personal opinions and play experiences with each of these tactics player and hero cards, which made their debut in our core set. How were they then, and how do they hold up in the context of our modern card pool? Do let us know in the comments, and with that said, if you have any desire whatsoever to get in touch with me, I'm the Hive Tyrant on Facebook and on Twitter, and of course, if you ever have any inclination whatsoever to help support the ongoing LOTR LCG progression series, I would definitely recommend that you check out my Patreon. But, as always, thank you so much for listening, and, once again, be sure to check back in again soon for much more LOTR LCG content to come.